Buenas tardes. Sí, bueno, le damos la bienvenida al profesor Luis Philippe Rochon. Él es editor de la revista Review of Keynesian Economics y va a estar aquí con nosotros. Tiene un currículum muy grande y a lo largo de más de 20 años hemos venido trabajando conjuntamente. Principalmente su tema es la endogeneidad del dinero y la política monetaria. Y en esta ocasión va a hablar sobre why is the banking system so important in understanding the Keynesian multiplier, a fresh look from an endogenous money perspective. Entonces, ¿cuál sería la importancia del sistema bancario? ¿Nada? ¿Cuál sería la importancia del sistema bancario? O sea, ¿por qué tan importante y cómo entender el multiplicador keynesiano? Una mirada fresca hacia las perspectivas de la endogeneidad monetaria. Bien, pues bienvenido Luis Philippe, nos da mucho gusto que estés aquí en México. Okay, so like this, well, okay, we have to put a very near because
Okay.
for that, because they are grabando.
Okay. Thank you very much. Like I said this morning, it's my pleasure to be back in Mexico. I am the editor of the Review of Keynesian Economics. I have about 10 copies here. I'd like to give them to students if they want to pick up a copy. For the past year, we've done a symposium on one theme, wage-led versus credit-led, wage-led versus profit-led growth, in honor of the 25th anniversary of the Margolin and Baduri and Blecker papers in 1989, 1990. And the fourth issue, this is the current issue, the July issue, which is the last one, will have an article by Baduri and an article by Margolin. So please pick up a copy after. My talk today is on why is the banking system so important for the multiplier analysis, fiscal multiplier. And what I want to do is I want to try to link up fiscal policy and monetary policy in a way that has never been done before. So in particular, I want to argue that credit cycles are important in understanding the effectiveness of fiscal policy. So I want to argue that the current understanding of, or how we understand the multiplier analysis is inconsistent with the notion of endogenous money, which is a core assumption of post-Keynesian analysis and heterodox analysis in general. So it's inconsistent. This is because the discussion of multiplier analysis, fiscal multiplier, output analysis, excludes the role of banks in financing production. So the challenge for post-Keynesians is that we need to integrate bank lending and finance into the theory of the multiplier. And this will result in a richer theory of the multiplier. So what's the current understanding of the multiplier? Now, I know there are leakages and etc., but the basic idea of the multiplier is that initial expenditure by government will lead to an income in the private sector, which will lead, based on the marginal propensity to consume, to further rounds of spending. And these further rounds of spending will eventually converge to an equilibrium level of income. Funny enough, I want to point out, Keynes never had a chapter on the multiplier in the general theory. But the idea of the multiplier was certainly in there. And they were a combination of marginal propensity to consume, liquidity preference, and the marginal efficiency of capital. But he had no chapter specifically on the multiplier. But after the publication of the general theory, and in this Keynesian revival of Keynes, the multiplier became a very central feature of the analysis. Just here I have a quote by Mead that essentially argues that output eventually converges after ever diminishing waves of expenditures. And so this is sort of the graphical that we teach our first year and that the students have learned in their undergraduate days. Yet, I want to argue that this story is simplistic. It's overly simplistic, in fact. And the crisis, the 2007 crisis, has in fact, one good thing, is that it has brought back the analysis of fiscal multipliers in light of fiscal expenditures, expansionary expenditures adopted by most governments after the crisis in 2009. And the recent literature is a bit more sophisticated in the sense that it argues that the multiplier, the value of the multiplier, is regime dependent. It means that the value of the multiplier changes through the business cycle. So it's a little bit more interesting in that sense. Now, Edward Nell wrote a little memo. He's never published it, but I was at a conference in his honor in 2014 at the New School, and Ed had this little paper that was circulating. And he says, well, this idea that the multiplier might change its value is in fact very much in Keynes and brought, revived by Duesenberry. So here he's got a quote by Duesenberry where he refers to Duesenberry where he says, the multiplier accelerator mechanism in the upswing of the cycle could be different from that in the downswing, and every cycle would be very likely different in some ways from every other. So, at least in those who do history of economic thought, the idea may not be all that new. So, like I said, there's been a lot of attention and a revival in multiplier analysis. Too many to quote. Here's just a few, and all have this share in this idea of regime-dependent multipliers, right? Depending on where you are in the regime, in the business regime. There's also an emerging post-Keynesian literature on that idea as well. More from a post-Keynesian perspective, but Willy Semler at the New School has written on that. Engelbert Stockhammer has written on that. I think Stockhammer visited your campus. Sébastien Charles and Jonathan Marie, and they've written, they're French economists, they've written on that, and a few others. And in fact, in 2018, I'm publishing a little mini symposium on the notion with papers from Stockhammer, Willy Semler, and Mark Setterfield. But none of these papers incorporate the banking system. And so from my perspective, there's still something lacking in that research. Now, there is a very small emerging literature on regime-dependent multipliers that do attempt to incorporate credit cycles. There's a wonderful paper from the Central Bank of Spain, and the author argues the importance of the state of credit markets in predicting the extent to which fiscal interventions can be effective in industrialized economies. So we're getting somewhere. Will Geckert, German guy, very much a post-Keynesian, close to the people like Eckert Hein and those people. He writes something based on actually a paper of mine, I'll get to that in a second. The multiplier does not fully account for the nature of a credit money economy and should therefore be upgraded. So there's starting to be this interest in credit markets and the relationship with fiscal multipliers. And, but to my knowledge, I mean, a handful of papers. I've only found about 4 or 5 papers on the topic. So recent literature, they will argue that in essence, that the fiscal multiplier is very strong during a recession and tends to be very weak in expansions. And these new Keynesian models are built on crowding out effects as well. So the argument is, since they're very strong during recessions, the government should spend a lot in recessions because you're going to have a bigger bang for their fiscal buck. Most post-Keynesian papers argue the same thing. They have the same conclusion. Fiscal multipliers are large in downturns and weaker in upswings. And this is just a couple of quotes. One's from Brad DeLong and Summers. The Keynesian multiplier is likely to be substantially greater than the relatively small value it is thought to have in normal times. So in not normal times, it is substantially greater. One paper by Semler that he published in 2012 is a very interesting quote, and I'll read it because Semler has come back to that argument. We show that the fiscal multiplier varies with the state of the business cycle and the particular specifics of the measures taken. For the US, we find, for example, the fiscal expansion multiplier is much higher in the regime of low economic activity than in the regime of high activity. So he does say that the fiscal multiplier is greater during a recession, but he does say that it depends on the particular specifics of the measures taken. There's a typo there. But he also says it depends on the proper typing of government expenditure programs that hence increase their effectiveness. So he seems to be skirting around the issue that fiscal policy will have an impact on the multiplier. Get back to that. I had a long talk with him on that, and when I presented my paper at the New School in honor of Ed, we had a talk about that, and because I actually say something very similar, and this is what I want to talk about today. I edited a book with Claude Noss in 2008 called The Keynesian Multiplier, and in there, my chapter, at the very end of the chapter, I argue that this suggests that not only the multiplier depends on the banking system, but it will vary through the cycle. In periods of optimism, when banks are more cooperative, that is, when credit is easier to obtain, there will be a greater multiplier. Back in 2008, the paper was written in 2007, so a good decade ago, I was talking already about these regime-dependent multipliers. The argument is not flushed out, and it's not really developed, but there's a kernel of idea there that I thought was very intriguing. So in a way, I overshadowed this emerging literature on regime-dependent multipliers. But I linked it to the banking system. And for me, that's what's missing from a lot of these current studies. For example, all of these studies have, consumption, payments of wages, and even production. But what's missing is the process of production. So from a post-Keynesian perspective or a circuitous perspective, production, investment are financed by bank lending or other types of lending or financing or funding, but assuming for now bank lending. And because production is financed through debt, the emission of debt, that debt has to be reimbursed to the banking system. And that, for me, is the key to understanding the role the banking system plays in the multiplier analysis. So for me, I'm not surprised that there's no endogenous money in Keynes, Because if you leave monetary details in the background, as Keynes tells us in the general theory, you essentially also put on the background this whole process of production. And so, for me, in the general theory, it was necessary for Keynes to assume exogenous money to have a multiplier analysis. Now, so I will argue why in a second. I'll develop the idea of why the banking system is important. But I also want to make another argument that the size of fiscal intervention will also have an influence on the value of the multiplier. In other words, multipliers are not only regime dependent, but they are also policy dependent. The bigger the fiscal multiplier, the bigger the fiscal intervention, the larger the value of the multiplier. But I will argue, contrary to all other studies out there, and I think to my knowledge, I'm the only one who's saying this, I argue that the multiplier, the value of the fiscal multiplier in a recession is naturally weak, as opposed to what other studies say. They argue the fiscal multiplier is large in recession. I argue it is naturally weak. So, regime-dependent multipliers are weak in recessions. However, as the state intervenes and spends, that spending has aggregate demand effects which increase the value of the multiplier. So, yes, provided governments spend a lot during recessions, you're going to have a large fiscal multiplier in recessions. So in the end, I arrive at the same conclusion as these other studies. But there's an important step here, because if during recessions governments don't spend and they adopt austerity measures, you're not going to have, or if they spend a little bit, you're not going to have a large multiplier effect. And I'll explain what that transmission mechanism of fiscal policy is. Now, after my talk with Semler in 2014, he sent us a paper for Roque, and he says, one can observe that the multiplier is not only dependent on the state of the business cycle, financial fragility and financial stress, but also subject to the size of fiscal action. Okay? So, in the end, Willy is saying exactly the same thing as I am. And in fact, when I presented my paper in New York, and I had this discussion with him after my paper, and during the talk I was pointing out his 2012 paper, and he was listening to me, and he was saying to me, at the end he says, well, actually we don't differ much in the end. And this paper that he's written sort of clarifies that position. So my conclusion, I'm not concluding my talk, but the conclusion so far is that failure to include banks and bank debt will have important policy implications. This does not diminish the important contributions of Keynes, but it does mean that we have to upgrade Keynes to include the theory of endogenous money. Now, I'm not going to get into a discussion, I don't have time in 40 minutes, about the importance of endogenous money and the mechanism and all that. But I will argue that in a paper that I wrote in a book in honor of Basil Moore, I developed sort of a supply theory of endogenous money, in which I argue that banks don't necessarily meet all the demand for credit. There is, in the words of Keynes, a fringe of unsatisfied customers, borrowers. And banks will regularly refuse credit because they don't deem you credit worthy enough. And the way it works is banks will have, I argued, both levels of micro uncertainty and macro uncertainty. And the macro uncertainty is how a bank evaluates a particular firm. Sort of Kalecki's principle of increasing risk. So if you individually, because of bad corporate practices, etc., are deemed non-credit worthy, the bank will not extend credit to you. The macro uncertainty is the bank's perception of future levels of effective demand. And if the bank is feeling optimistic, in the words of Keynes, right? Keynes argues in terms of bursts of optimism and pessimism. He doesn't apply that to the banking system, but I do. Banks will have bursts of optimism because they're feeling optimistic about future levels of effective demand. And so their lending practices will increase. And in several countries, including Mexico, you have data on where central banks ask banks about their expectations and how that relates to their bank lending. And there was a famous paper published in 1998 in the JPKE by, I've read that paper 100 times and I forget the name, where he argues this. And so banks will become more optimistic. And in downturns, in recessions, banks become very pessimistic and they'll stop. They'll cut lending. Okay? In the name of Alain Parguez, banks are making bets on the business cycle. So if the bank lends, the only thing it wants in return is, can you reimburse me? Can you reimburse your debt? And if future levels of effective demand are looking good, well, it assumes that you'll be able to reimburse your debt, so it will lend more. But the opposite in times of recession. Now, how does this affect the multiplier? Assume there's initial increase in fiscal expenditure. Some people call it a fiscal shock. So the government increases its expenditure. This is then a revenue for the private sector. So in that sense, there's no difference from the point of view of firms between selling goods to households or selling goods to the state. It's a revenue. Now, in order to begin production, that firm in period T must get into a position of debt vis-a-vis the bank, pays wages, and then reimburses the bank from the stream of revenues coming from either the private sector, household consumption, or the state through fiscal expenditures. Now, state spends money, the private sector receives it, and reimburses the bank. At that point, right, if you remember Keynes's 1937 papers on a revolving door of funds, the bank will either renew your loan or cancel it, either because anticipations of effective demand have changed. Banks became maybe more pessimistic in that period. So it will look at constraining bank lending. And if that's the case and decides to not lend to you anymore, then that initial fiscal expenditure ends up being truncated. It doesn't go anywhere. The government spends, gives you 1 million pesos, and you reimburse the bank, but then if you can't renew production, that's it. But if the firm or if the bank decides to renew your production, then you get that second round of spending, just like in the traditional simplistic view of the multiplier. But that second and third round is never automatic. It always depends at every stage on the decision by the banking system. So the fiscal multiplier is not an automatic phenomenon. It depends on the decision of the banking system. And this is what I'm trying to say here. Initial injections of funds to the private sector, which must go through the banking system, and if it succeeds, starts again and again and again. So if banks refuse to lend again, the multiplier process is interrupted. In a recession, banks are pessimistic and loan supply is restricted. So the natural level, the natural value of that multiplier is small, unless the banking system allows it to become bigger. Now, there's an important role here for fiscal policy, because by spending, it actually raises the credit worthiness of the business sector. So imagine imagine austerity. During periods of austerity, individual firms may be still creditworthy, but a large majority of firms will no longer be creditworthy, especially since the standards, the lending standards of the banking system would have increased during recessions. It becomes more difficult to qualify for a loan. But the action of fiscal expenditures raises the creditworthy of firms and makes it easier for firms to qualify for lending in the second round. Now, if you go back to Richard Kahn's? Jeez, I'm tired. Huh? Yeah. If you go back to Kahn's original 1931 paper, he says that the multiplier depends on the intelligent cooperation of the banking system. And he says, otherwise, all efforts may be rendered nugatory, nil. So the exact quote is, if the increased circulation of notes and the increased demand for working capital that may result from increased employment are made the occasion for a restriction of credit, then any attempts to increase employment, whether it is by way of road building or by other means, or indeed by awaiting the return of world prosperity, may be rendered nugatory. Now, Trevithick, in 1994, Trevithick wrote a really famous paper with Nicholas Kaldor on endogenous money. And wrote this. He says, he argues that a policy of monetary accommodation, we can argue what it means, monetary accommodation, but I certainly understand it to mean possibly a banking, the banking system, bank lending, is in general a prerequisite for the multiplier process to become airborne. In the absence of such a policy of monetary accommodation, a program of public rates works to raise the levels of output employment will be put in unnecessary jeopardy. Ingraziani, Bellofiore and Passerella wrote a paper in which they say, in Graziani's theoretical scheme, the effectiveness of government spending and taxation is affected crucially by the reaction of the firms. Should firms not wish to modify their production plans following a change in the fiscal monetary policy stance, then no effect on the level of real income and distribution would materialize. Now, these reaction of the firms also depends on their ability to secure financing. So, although Graziani never really talked in terms of how I say it, it would certainly, I think, is consistent with his views. And I think he would probably approve of what I'm saying. Now, Richard Werner, who's a British economist who is some sort of post-Keynes, I'm not too sure how to define him, but certainly he's come close to saying something like that as well. I've been rushing, and I've skipped some explanation, but we're almost done. I wanted to argue that, yes, this value of the multiplier changes through the cycle, but it depends also on the banking system. And that's an important ingredient. If the banking system is not being cooperative, then you're not going to have large fiscal multipliers. So that's the regime-dependent nature. But it also depends on fiscal policy. If increases in fiscal policy increases the creditworthiness of bank borrowers, then that will have a positive impact on multiplier analysis. Now, I want to, so in other words, state expenditures can help in reducing what I've called macro uncertainty by increasing aggregate demand. So in the end, I'm saying the same thing as other post-Keynesians, but they go from 1 to 3. I go through a little hurdle, and that hurdle I think is important because it shows that if during recessions governments don't spend sufficiently, they are not going to have an important effect on output. And what that consequences of that could be, we're living through that right now in Canada. Promises of increasing fiscal policy to help the economy. The government did just a little bit. Our deficit to GDP is 1.5, very small in terms of historical levels. What that's happening is it's having very little effect on output. And now the Austerians are coming out saying, you see, fiscal policy doesn't work. Well, it doesn't work because the fiscal response wasn't large enough. So that added step of adding the banking system in there is important for that reason alone. Now, I want to conclude with this. Why am I reaching sort of a, different results than most people who simply argue fiscal multipliers are large? Well, most econometric models have been done after the 2009 fiscal expenditures. And these expenditures were large. So what these econometric studies are observing, are measuring, is the policy-dependent nature of the multiplier. But if the fiscal response had not been as large, I'm ready to bet that these studies would have found smaller values of the multiplier. I'm just going to end here. I just want to say last thing, because I see my colleague in the back there. Does this raise the need for a public bank? So I just want to raise that as a question. I think it does, and we can talk about it later. And that's it. I don't think I went over. Sorry, I just rushed a little bit, but yeah, questions. I mean, I said it was going to end at 5:40.
Muy bien. ¿Algunas preguntas que quisieran? Sí. Queríamos hacerlo con papelitos, pero bueno, si quieres hazlo y ahorita.
I have. And I think that my paper would argue on the surface that it doesn't matter. But I think that we can then further the research. And I agree, there are some spending that would be more effective, absolutely. But I think that on the surface of it, when the government spends, the mechanism of that fiscal policy would be the same, although in some sectors you might have an even greater impact. Yeah. Yeah, no, and I absolutely agree. And I should specify that. You're right. my argument was in terms of production and stuff. But I would absolutely agree on the composition of fiscal policy. Yes.
Yes, I remember very well in a discussion of around the PhD thesis of the student of Noemi, we discussed precisely, or I discussed precisely this point about the composition of the public expenditure. But it is also important, I think so, not only the composition of but also the composition of the economy, you know, because it is very different effect that we can find at the fiscal multiplier in an economy with different degrees of concentration, of economic concentration, especially in the industry and especially in the production sector.
Yes. No, I understand I understand your question. These are questions that would apply to any study on fiscal multipliers. You know, the measurement of multipliers and the effectiveness and et cetera. And I don't disagree with it. What I am saying is that you need to include a discussion of the banks, the role of banks. No, but you go like this. But, you know, well, you know, when I presented this paper, I've presented this paper maybe 5, 6 times now. And half the times people literally almost boo me off the stage. And the other times, the people are saying, oh, this is magnificent. And so you're going, yeah, of course. But I can tell you other places, they were going, no. You know, and for me, what I find fundamental, and these other places were post-Keynesian places, and what I find very strange is that here we are, as post-Keynesian, and we say endogenous money. And I go, great, let's apply it to fiscal multiplier and production because it's all related. And they go, oh, no, we shouldn't talk. And I'm going, well, that's inconsistent. And so what I'm trying to say is we need, and you know what, maybe, and there's a lot of black holes in my talk right now. I just want to have that first step in saying, let's agree that we need a banking system, and then let's agree, and everyone would have things to bring to the table. But let's first agree, and that agreement is not there. And I can tell you, a lot of people are saying, that's ridiculous. And then other people are saying, yeah, you're absolutely right. There's nothing new here, so and in a way, as a researcher, that's sort of the position you want to be in, right? You want to be in a position where people will say, oh, that's great, and other people will say, that's awful. And that means great. That means it's, it's right, it's leading to a discussion and maybe, hopefully, more research. Yes, absolutely. Well, we can talk about many ways how that works. In this specific way, I'm looking at the banking sector. And so the banking sector is in the business of lending, perhaps less and less so. So to my friend here, maybe we have to look at other sources of finance. But, banking sector, in the traditional theory of the monetary circuit and post-Keynesians, they lend to start production. But that lending process, depends on the bank's willingness to lend. So money is endogenous and all that, but the banks may want to impose constraints. And those constraints will depend on the mood. You said the word mood, on their mood. And that's essentially, what it is. It's their mood, how they are interpreting future stages of the cycle, when the downturn is coming, So depending on how they interpret future levels of aggregate demand, they will be either more optimistic or more pessimistic. So, right now, banks are very pessimistic, and net lending is not growing as much. And that's the rationale behind those unconventional policies. I mean, theoretically, they're wrong, but how the mainstream is interpreting these, quantitative easing and negative interest rates is because banks are not lending sufficiently. So we got to get them lending again. So there's a general sense of, although it's starting to change, I've seen some recent data that banks are becoming a little bit more optimistic. And so lending will start increasing again. And as that lending increases, then if governments keep lending, then you're going to have very large multipliers. So that's when you need governments to start cutting back in the upswing to regulate that business cycle. So I don't know if I've answered your question. But I wrote that paper in a Festschrift for Basil Moore that was edited by Mark Setterfield. And you know the book. It's in the library. And so I wrote that sort of, I think it's the supply theory of endogenous money or something like that, where I zeroed in on Keynes's fringe of unsatisfied borrowers. And I tried to develop that into a micro theory of bank lending.
But so you're talking about the multiplier and what relation will have the multiplier? What relation will be with the multiplier and the shadow banking? Is there a relation, or are you just talking only about banks, but banks meaning that also they are the institutional investors and also the hedge funds and all no? So everything that can lend, you're putting in the definition of bank, right?
You're right about that. And that goes to Eric's point that we talked about yesterday. I think we talked about it a couple of days. And I agree with that. But that does raise the issue. It's fun talking about this here because I'm not getting this sort of nasty response that I've had elsewhere. But that only shows that, once I published a paper, maybe then we can discuss ways of, sort of disaggregating my analysis and trying to really, I'm just talking about a very main transmission mechanism and relationship, but I'm sure there's like a million ones that feed into that, and we need to discuss this, and I'm completely open. And I have to admit, I haven't thought about that as much, or what Noemi was talking about, because I'm preoccupied about the main argument at this point and trying to flesh it out, and at times being very sort of discouraged by the reaction I've had from some people. But once I get this, maybe I'll get energized again to start thinking about all the little sort of million little questions that pop up.
Because I think it's very interesting the things that you were talking about, but all the work that the central banks made between 2007 and after Lehman Brothers, where does that money went? Where do they go?
Well,
and you don't have productivity, you don't have production.
Yeah, no, but you're right. But
it came down and then came down.
We're losing students by. They're bored with my ideas.
Because they are having another class.
We've got pictures of every one of you. We're gonna. Well, quantitative easing is a very interesting. I can talk about it for hours, and I think we've talked about it. In fact, for me, it was a wealth policy, right? So it went into the hands of the bondholders, and so when interest rates are very low, and you have the euthanasia of the rentier, and rents are almost non-existent on when rates are zero in the United States, as they were, the central bank had to intervene to prop up the value of those of bondholders, and so that went into. And so I was asked that question by Pares Caldente about that. And I argued that, well, I don't think there was much of a wealth effect from quantitative easing. And it all went into the hands of the rentiers, and they just got richer. And I don't think there was, it filtered through the economy as much. But that's an open question that needs to be answered and studied.
Luis Philippe, thank you very much. Well, maybe we can continue talking until night, and you have to take a flight, right? So we have our next presentation, and here we will continue. We don't have any break right now because here is Professor Perrotini, who has just arrived. Oh, hi, Ignacio, and maybe we will continue with the presentations of our books. It's supposed that Eugenia, who are going to be here? ¿Quiénes van a estar? Pepe Denis, Eric Haig, Julio Castellanos y Juan Carlos Moreno Brid. So, si pueden ir pasando para acá, para irnos sentando. Y Ignacio, le dejo la mesa. Y bueno, mientras que vienen y hacemos el cambio de presidium, si quisieras comentarles la invitación a mañana. Empezamos aquí a las 9 de la mañana con la mesa de financiarización y crisis. Posteriormente, a las 10:30 tenemos la conferencia de Juan Carlos Barrón, que es Aspectos geopolíticos de los medios de comunicación masiva y la transformación del sistema mundo. Después tenemos financiamiento endógeno y ciclo económico. La otra mesa, estancamiento y crédito en América Latina. Y en la tarde vamos a tener una conferencia de Pepe Denis, ¿sí? que es sobre globalización, integración y nuevo proteccionismo, Pepe. Y los queremos invitar a las 6:30 de la tarde. Mañana, o sea, terminamos aquí a las 6:15 y nos vamos a la Facultad de Economía, al auditorio Ho Chi Minh, y ahí se va a entregar el reconocimiento Ifigenia Martínez al doctor Enrique Semo. Bien, entonces le dejo la mesa a Ignacio Perrotini, al doctor Perrotini, por favor. Bien, ok, pues. No, yo creo que te sientas aquí si quieres aquí en medio, porque tú eres el moderador. Aquí te lo doy. Sí, ya no hacemos break, porque si no, Julio Castellanos, Pepe Denis, si quieres pasar, Eric Haig, Arturo y Juan Carlos Moreno. Sorry, this is your.
Thank you very much.
And this is a program if you want to have it. ¿Qué son, Ya, ok, venmelos pasando. Pero ese es, oye, por aquí había un contrato nuevo. Estaba hablando. Alma dejó su dirección. Sí, yo me di cuenta. Ajá. Entonces, pues ya lo corregimos. ¿Los van a llevar ahorita? Mañana. A ver si ya están los reembolsos, ¿no? Sí, pregunto. Ya sería poco. ¿Ya? Ok, y ya de ahorita ya se van para allá. Yo ya regreso a la oficina y ya me voy. Ok. Mañana y Andrea están en reunión con el ¿y ahorita los vas a llevar entonces eso o ya no? Mañana. Bueno, ok. Ándale, nos vemos, bye. Sí, utilicé estos. Así que perfecto. los que están aquí. Porque todavía no llega, entonces pero ya casi ya estamos todos. Los mismos los tenemos ¿cómo se llama? Aquí en pantalla. Y después, pero a ver, déjame ver, porque aquí no tenía, cada quien tenía que hablar de varios libros. Ay, eres un Sí, pero a ver, déjame decirle que venga para que ya hay que tomarnos una foto antes de que, porque si no termina esto y no nos vamos. Tenemos la foto. Espérate.
How are you?
Okay, thank you. How are you?
What's this big news you wanted to tell me?
Wow, lots of things has happened. Yeah, I became the general coordinator of economics, the right department of economics.
I heard.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
The whole thing. Yeah. So an opportunity to do things. You know?
Good, very good.
So we have to talk about that.
Okay,
So we
okay,
can
yeah, for sure.
coordinate things.
There's a lot of stuff, and
Yeah.
we should try to, because I know you're close to Tom as well, so we should try to do something for Roke.
That's fine.
You know,
Yeah,
a symposium and a little,
Exactly.
you know, something.
Exactly.
So
We'll do that.
we should,
Yeah.
and Tom will be on board, and Matthias as well.
Yeah, of course. I mean, much people. Okay. Ajá. Okay. En esa computadora. Okay. Entonces yo me siento allá o qué? Okay. So sí, we have to. We have to. No, I don't mind. We have to switch seats.
I'm on the editorial board. How come you don't give those out to people of your editorial board? Are you sure? Okay, I really want to.
Yes. El botón de la financiera.
Okay. So.
Sí, yo creo que entonces tú te cambias.
So, Luis Felipe, I'm sorry to bother you, but we have to switch seats because
He's going to.
I chair the session.
Alejandra, ya hay una.
Bueno, yo me siento acá. ¿Dónde está Parte?
Mejor se va a quedar abajo. Ahorita que suba, yo presento el mío y luego subo Parte y ya presento el mío.
Ok.
¿Sí, no? Te dejo mi silla.
Tú nos vas diciendo, ¿no?
Ahí, Nacho los tiene todos ahí. Sí, en ese orden.
Spanish or English? Yeah? But how about Eric? Eric? Maybe, yeah, I can speak French too.
And then,
Italian, Chinese.
Or Italian. Yeah, why not?
ibas a hacer unos comentarios, ¿no?
So, él hace comentarios de los libros. Ok. Ya, ya. Ya llegó, lo que pasa es que está de incógnito. Bueno, pero entonces... ¿Ya? Okay, well, good evening. I'm sorry, but we have to speak English because we have some colleagues as visitors, and then for respect, we have to speak the language that is the lingua franca that everyone is able to understand. Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm glad to chair this session, which is about the presentation of a number of books that have been published recently. And so we have here on board the colleagues that have been in charge of editing and coordinating such books. So we will start with this book that was edited by our friends Alicia Girón and Eugenia Correa, Reorganización Financiera en Asia y América Latina en el periodo de post-crisis. So please take about 3 minutes to give us a sense as the main ideas contained in this interesting book that we are eager to read from cover to cover. So please do so. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to do it in Spanish because my English is not so good, but I will try it. Well, the title, well, this book was organized between our fiscal and financial seminar and the Seminar of Asian Studies. And the theme was to see the financial relations that we are having between Asia and Africa, but exactly after Lehman Brothers. And most of the people were engaged in what was going on, not only financialization, but also the relation between the productive sectors, especially by the banking, the Chinese bankings, and the big investments that they have done in the Pacific, in the Asia Pacific area. So this book is sponsored by the seminar, the Asian Seminar. It's also sponsored by the Coordinación de Humanidades, the School of Economics, and the Economic Research Institute. And it couldn't be published, well, just for this seminar, but I think in 6 or 8 weeks, we are having the book. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Alicia. Yeah, why not? Let's clap. Yeah. I didn't mention that we are also expecting Professor Juan Carlos Moreno Brit to make comments on all the book that will be presented this afternoon. So he will come right here afterwards. Now, next we have the presentation of a book also edited by Alicia and Eugenia and Patricia Rodriguez, which is titled Stagnation and Deflation in a Global World. So I don't know who is going to present. Oh, yeah. Yeah, Eugenia will do that.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. Well, it is important to underline that we are presenting 5 books produced by this seminar in the last 5 years. And also we will present several books of our network of research of all that we, let's say, form in the last 20 years. We have books of some of them, because there are another books published by our friends and our members of this network in the last few years, but we have here only 15 books, and it's too much to present only. But I know that we have more books. Let's say, for example, the book, the Julio Castellanos book, the Monica book, I think that Francisco book, and other books that they are not here, but we cannot include every single book because we have a lot of books now. This book is Stagnation and Deflation in the Global War. It tried to look about the major trends in the last 8 years after the global financial crisis that we have in 2008. We have several articles there, especially from Wesley Marshall and of course Sergio Cabrera, Patricia Rodriguez, our very dearly Professor Teresa Aguirre, and Marcia Solorza. And I think that we collect, this global issue, this global view about what is happening with the major trends in financial, after the financial crisis. Well, this book is not outside, but you can buy several of these books outside in a very special price for the people that come to this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eugenia. I'm sure this book is really appealing, not perhaps for Mexicans, because as we know, there is stagnation all over the world, but in Mexico. So it's got to be a very interesting book to read, even if there is no stagnation in Mexico. Of course, I'm kidding. Now, we have another book also edited by the Alicia Giron, Eugenia Correa, and Patricia Rodriguez. This is a book entitled Credit and Money Transitions in the 21st Century. And I presume that Patricia is going to present it as I see her running in front. Por favor, Patricia.
Yo lo voy a decir en español para que ahora sí me entiendan todos. Bueno, son dos tomos los que estamos aquí presentando. Los dos son de 2015. Este de crédito y moneda básicamente habla sobre las nuevas condiciones y cómo se comportaron las líneas de crédito a nivel internacional después de la gran crisis 2008-2009 en distintos países. Son 14 autores, en los que solamente entre este libro y este libro quien coincide es Eugenia Correa. Y Tsuyoshi Yasuhara, que son los dos autores que coinciden en tocar estos dos temas. Los dos hablan de la tendencia sobre el crédito mundial, internacional, pero también específicamente en algunos países como es Chile y Brasil. Entonces es algo bastante interesante. Este libro, perdón, no, ¿van los dos?
Sí.
Ok, este otro libro también de 2015, parte del grupo también de aquí de los seminarios, son 14 autores. Aquí está Gregorio Vidal, está también es Noemí, por ejemplo, como alguien que también estuvo aquí participando. Son también 14 trabajos y básicamente habla sobre los nuevos circuitos monetarios. Este es primero que este libro y habla sobre todos los problemas y todos los problemas que tuvo en los circuitos monetarios y la nueva arquitectura que se necesita del sistema monetario internacional después de la crisis de 2008 y 2009. Son 14 trabajos, como les digo, y básicamente es a nivel internacional y solamente se especifican con 2 trabajos del país de México, específicamente los 2 trabajos sobre esto. Chile también aquí con Alejandro y son también como productos de algunos de los seminarios. Ok, creo que esto es todo.
Gracias, Patricia. So this second volume for our friends from abroad is on monetary circuits, financial fragility and structural change. Now we have another book, also coordinated by Eugenia Correa and Alicia Giron. As you can see, our friends are very productive. And this is a book on Jan Kregel's contributions, monetary economics, monetary, monetary economy, the monetary economy of the production, money instability and crisis. So I don't know who's going to present this book, please.
Sí, este libro es resultado de una búsqueda, por supuesto asesorada por Jan Kregel, de los mejores artículos que a lo largo de su vida profesional ha escrito y precisamente hablan sobre una economía monetaria de la producción. O sea, este concepto que Paul Davidson lo ha desarrollado muchísimo y es parte de un concepto de la línea de los post-keynesianos, él lo trata en diferentes capítulos y son artículos que la doctora Correa ha traducido junto con su equipo de aquí del Centro de Estudios Centro de Investigación de Economía Financiera, de aquí de la Facultad de Economía, y que, bueno, se publicó gracias al apoyo también de PAPIT, de uno de los tantos proyectos PAPIT que hemos tenido, y del financiamiento de la Facultad de Economía y del Instituto de Investigaciones Económicas. Realmente yo los invito a que lean este trabajo porque quizás Jan a lo largo de sus años ha hecho cosas interesantes y que sobre todo para nuestros alumnos del campo de economía financiera es un libro que vale la pena leerlo porque la mayoría son aportaciones a la teoría, pero desde el punto de vista de la economía monetaria de la producción, que es un concepto clave para poder entender el desarrollo del capitalismo. Gracias.
Gracias, Alicia. Luego, now we have books by the members of the NET. And here we have a book, Post-Keynesian Economics, Volume 1, Issues in Methodology, coordinated by our friend Louis-Philippe Rochon and Sergio Rossi. So I presume that, Louis-Philippe, it's your turn.
Thank you. In fact, yes, there's 3 volumes. The next one is volume 1, 2, and then 3. Yes. So this is an anthology published by Edward Elgar on what Sergio Rossi and I consider are the best articles in post-Keynesian economics written in English since about, we dated it to about since 1956, which we think is the beginning of the post-Keynesian school with the publication of Joan Robinson's Accumulation of Capital. So it's, we publish in volume 1 issues and methodology, so it's 900 pages and it's got probably about 30 articles in the volume 1, same in volume 2. Volume 2 is exclusively dedicated to credit money, endogenous money, banking issues. And volume 3 is sort of a mix of, whatever's left, but asset bubbles, financial crisis, growth, development, employment, and distribution. So it's just a collection. It's really intended for libraries. They are very expensive. The 3 of them are about 40,000 pesos. So they really are rather expensive. I'm only getting 1 copy. So, but they're good collections of articles. And so in volume 1 also there's micro issues, markup pricing. There's a small section on MMT in volume 2. The best articles on endogenous money, on Keynes's finance motives. So a number of issues dear to post-Keynesians and in these volumes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Luis Philippe. I mean, this seems to be a very impressive, amount of job, work. Now we have another book, A Modern Guide to Rethinking Economics, edited by Luis Philippe and Sergio Rossi. So please give us a sense about this book.
Thank you very much. First, I want to say I'm an avid collector of Quebec art, and a lot of my books have some of my paintings on the cover of the books. This is one by Florence Victor. So this book comes out of I was visiting professor in Dijon back, I think, in 2015, and we had a symposium for one day on rethinking economics, and there was only about eight papers, and we didn't know quite what to do with it, and Sergio Rossi and I figured, well, we should do a book on rethinking economics and invite other contributions, and that's what we did. And the first two articles are very broad. One by Claude Gnos is Rethinking the Foundations of Macroeconomics. Hassan Bougrin has Rethinking the Role of the State. So all from a very heterodox perspective. But we have, a chapter on rethinking pluralism, rethinking uncertainty, rethinking exchange and prices, rethinking money, rethinking growth, rethinking income distribution, fiscal policy, banks, monetary policy. And we even have on development, health economics, international trade, international financial architecture, rethinking the environment, rethinking energy policy, rethinking politics, social security, and anti-poverty policy. So it's a book that is available now in pre-order. It's not out yet. It should be out in April. And so it has about 21 chapters. And there's already talk about doing a second edition, in which we want to add other topics that post-Keynesians usually don't talk about, but rethinking cities, urban transportation, rethinking. So a lot of issues that would be interesting in terms of the need to rethink the way we approach a lot of these problems. And so that's what this book is about.
Thank you very much, Luis Philippe. And now we have another book also edited by Luis Philippe and Sergio Rossi, An Introduction to Macroeconomics. And this is also a very important book that should be available not only in English but also in Spanish. And it will be available in Spanish in the near future. I will give Luis Philippe information about this, but it's being approved that the book will be translated into Spanish. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Again, one of my paintings. So this book comes from out of the idea that I get a number of emails every year, and I'm sure a lot of people do. What book do you use in principles or second year economics? And a lot of scholars, a lot of post-Keynesian heterodox scholars were forced to use very traditional mainstream books. I even used Robert Barrow one year in Principles Macro to my chagrin. And so the idea with Sergio was there is no post-Keynesian heterodox textbook out there. And so we started with that idea of wanting to do one. And it's very difficult because from a pedagogical, perspective, there's not much, there's a lot of stuff for graduate students, and the like. Marc Lavoie's book is a phenomenal book, but it's meant for graduate studies. So we wanted to have something for undergraduates, and this is where this book comes in. And from a very faithful to the post-Keynesian idea of monetary analysis à la Schumpeter, chapter 3 is on money, and chapter 4 is on the banking system. And then the book has a very traditional sense of, topics, like, we have a chapter on, certainly on the environment and on trade and all of that. And it's edited by different people. So it's got Mario Sequereccia in it, and Marc Lavoie, and Robert Blecker, and John King has a wonderful chapter on micro foundations. And I forget who's got I get confused between one book and another, but it's got wonderful contributions, and it's meant to be sort of a book aimed for undergraduates, and it's already have been adopted by about 88 heterodox scholars around the world, so it's doing really well, and we're hoping to really sort of push this, that it will become sort of the main post-Keynesian introductory textbook. And on the side note, I just want to add that Matthias Vernengo myself, and Esteban Perez Caldente, we're working on a series of 20 books for undergraduates. And these would all be single-authored books on, money and banking and development and trade and microeconomics and, but all from a very heterodox post-Keynesian perspective. And the idea is to come out with 5 books in 2020, I think, and then 5 in 21, and 5 in 22 and 23. And by 2023, there'll be 20 books for teaching undergraduates on 20 different topics. Okay, so I'll have more to say on that in 2021.
Wow. Okay, sounds great. All right. So we have one more book, The Neoliberal Political Economy in Mexico. Who decided how he did it? He did it, or she did it. Alejandra Salas Porras will present it.
Thank you. Okay. Well, what I do in this book is try to show how the political economy was transformed from one led by the state to one led by the market. And the main purpose is to identify the main architects of this transformation in Mexico. And I identify 20 public officers as the main architects of this transformation. And what I try to do is how they organize to push all the reforms forward during the past 30 years, how they organize in teams, in networks, whereby they guarantee the continuity of this transformation. So this is, the main idea, and what I found is that some of these public officials concentrating in the transformation of the trade regime in Mexico, other officials concentrate in the transformation of the financial regime, and in the process, these same public officials transform themselves. They change dramatically from what public officials used to be. The social practices that they practice are a lot more oriented. They're oriented transnationally. Some of them participate very, very actively in international organizations, such as the Bank of International Settlements, such as Agustin Carsten, who is, as we all know, is going to head these banking institutions, and some others go to the OCDE. So really, there is a mutual transformation. They transform the economy, but they also transform themselves, and their social identity changes dramatically in the process. So this is the main idea of the book. Very different from the other books that
Okay, thank you very much, Alejandra. And again, a book coordinated by Eugenia Correa, but this time along with Antonio Gasol. The NAFTA 20 years after. Eugenia, please.
Well, this is a book produced by the Academia Mexicana de Economía Política. It was produced discussing the issue about the NAFTA, precisely 20 years after the NAFTA sign. And well, it was a huge discussion between let's say, one of the organizations with the major economists in political economy, and also in economic policy that we have in Mexico and in this university and other public universities too. We discussed also the agriculture sector, but the energy sector, the banking sector, and all the chapters of the agreement and the major consequences that we achieved in these 20 years of NAFTA. Right now, of course, this book must be discussed again, especially because all of you know the new policy of the U.S. government that they want to renegotiate the NAFTA, and of course, here in the university we need to have a position about the points that we need to include or erase in the NAFTA previous treatment. Well, thank you. That's all. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Eugenia. And next, a book coordinated by Rodolfo Garcia Zamora.
Well, Rodolfo Garcia Zamora has told me that he couldn't be here today, but he will be with us tomorrow with in this aguar of the Ifigenia Martinez aguar that we will have tomorrow in 24 hours more at the Ho Chi Minh Auditorium.
Okay, thank you.
But Rodolfo Garcia Zamora told me that it is a very original research that they present in this book, that it will be available in 2 weeks more. It is a very original because they have they made several surveys, especially in these regions of the different states that they study, the return of the migrants to Mexico and the problems that they have in this return. It is a very, how do you say, a special book because it is supported by a number of very, very deeply and good design surveys in these states. Thank you.
Okay, all right, thank you. Now a book coordinated by Gregorio Vidal, The World Economy and the Process of Regional Integration and Regionalization.
Well, if someone is interested in the book is outside, but Gregorio Vidal he couldn't come because he's right now in Torreon presented the postgraduate program of the university, Metropolitan University. Then he couldn't make it to be here.
Okay. And now a book by Jose Denis and Eugenia Correa, the coordinators, strategies, in primary exporters in the global world.
De cerca, así. Bueno, buenas tardes. Yo voy a hablar en español, que es el único idioma que conozco. Espero que ustedes lo entiendan. Esto segundo fue una maldad. Lo aclaro por si no quedó claro. El libro se llama Estrategias Primario Exportadoras en un Mundo Global, que ha sido coordinado por la doctora Correa y por quien suscribe, y donde escriben conocidos como la propia doctora Correa, como la doctora Alicia Girón, de los aquí presentes y de los ausentes, James Martin Seifer, que seguramente lo conocerán de referencia, Rodolfo García Zamora, que ya ha sido citado hace unos instantes, un zacatecano llamado Arturo Burnes, dos canadienses llamados Ricardo Grispun y Mario Secareccia, y el libro, como lo indica su título, discute, plantea el debate sobre lo primario exportador en un mundo global, pero básicamente en América Latina, con estudios de caso para Zacatecas. De ahí que los temas que se traten es la minería en la historia del desarrollo latinoamericano, como una visión de conjunto, Seifer habla de la economía política de América Latina, reprimarización durante y después del auge de los commodities. Como todos sabemos, todo el proceso de ISI, del modelo de industrialización por sustitución de importaciones, fue sustituido a posteriori por recuperar los viejos tiempos primarios exportadores. Y ahí es donde lo centra Seifer básicamente, y en buena medida es una discusión que está presente en este libro. También debemos recordar que no todos los países de América Latina asumieron el modelo ISI, que algunos lo hicieron en unas épocas y otros en otras épocas. Algunos lo hicieron previo a la Segunda Guerra Mundial, en los años 30, algunos a partir de los primeros años 30, y otros posteriormente. Y otros nunca dejaron de ser primario exportadores. No obstante, la tendencia ha sido de hablar de una reprimarización. Interesante. Digo, porque el debate más antiguo es, insisto, que no fue algo generalizado lo de la industrialización. Ojo, y que fueron en tiempos distintos. No es lo mismo industrializarse en el año 30, por decir, el famoso modelo de Getúlio Vargas del Estado Novo en Brasil, a hacerlo en la década de los 70, por decir. García Zamora y con él Juan Manuel Padilla vuelven a recuperar la temática de la minería, por razones que ustedes comprenderán perfectamente, pero vinculada al extractivismo y al debate correspondiente, que es mucho más reciente. En el caso de Alicia Girón, lo plantea en términos también del modelo extractivista, con los recursos no renovables en un sendero para alcanzar el desarrollo, se plantea. Ojo, esto es bien importante, por lo que en algunos casos latinoamericanos el extractivismo y el llamado neoextractivismo se convirtieron en ejes de políticas económicas con distintos modelos de desarrollo, inclusive en algún caso muy concreto, con algún modelo que pretende ser alternativo al desarrollo convencional capitalista. Arturo Burnes, a quien yo recordaba como zacatecano, plantea el nuevo modelo extractivista y lo orienta al caso de Zacatecas. Que a no olvidar, Zacatecas es un caso bien representativo de exportar minerales y mano de obra. Perdón por la ironía de exportar, porque incluyo aquí a las personas, pero para que quede provocativamente claro a lo que me refiero. En el caso de Grispoon, es el caso de Canadá, extractivismo y las relaciones hemisféricas, dada la importancia que tiene Canadá en todo el mundo de la minería, incluido naturalmente México. Secarella se orienta un poco también en la misma dirección de la experiencia canadiense, vinculándolo e introduciendo elementos teóricos que me parecen muy sugerentes, sobre todo en discutiéndolo con el paradigma cepalino. Y finalmente, Eugenia Correa habla sobre los mercados financieros en la explotación de bienes primarios. Tema que en la jornada de hoy todo lo que tiene que ver con la financiarización está en primera línea. Este es el libro, queda muy mal decir que se los recomiendo, pero sí vale la pena leer algún que otro capítulo, por lo menos. Nada más, muchas gracias y perdón si me extendí.
Gracias, José. No, al contrario, fue muy ilustrativo lo que nos contaste y desde luego que al menos a mí me llama la atención leer este libro. Okay, now we have another book. This time is by Arturo Guillén. I don't know if you can read it. The Global Crisis in its Labyrinth. So I think Arturo is here.
Sí, hola, buenas tardes. Pues muy rápido telegrafiar, este libro ya se ha presentado en otras sesiones de presentación aquí en la UNAM y en la UAM, pero básicamente este libro que se llama La crisis global en su laberinto es un libro individual que preparé y terminé a finales de 2015, salió a finales de 2015 en realidad. Empezó a circular por ahí de los primeros meses de 2016. El objeto del libro es básicamente tiene dos partes, digamos, una parte más de narrativa, de lectura de la crisis global que comienza en 2007, de las distintas etapas por las que ha atravesado la crisis en sus diversos momentos, planteando la idea de que es una crisis no superada, pero que incluso se puede periodizar y que ha ido cambiando de foco, de crisis financiera en los países, digamos, en Estados Unidos y en los países centrales, a propiamente la… ¿No se oye? ¿Sí? Es decir, ha ido cambiando y pasando por diversas etapas. Se toca el asunto de la crisis europea, de la gran recesión y después el traslado del foco hacia los países emergentes. Y una segunda parte en donde pretendo hacer un análisis más de tipo teórico, partiendo desde luego de la caracterización que se hizo de la crisis como un momento Minsky, como una crisis de deuda deflación, caracterización que en el libro yo considero que fue correcta en cuanto al detonador de esa crisis, la causa, digamos, inmediata de la crisis o eficiente, pero que atrás de ella están otros problemas ligados a la formación de la tasa de ganancia, en particular a la formación de la ganancia financiera, y trato de ahondar en ese punto retomando alguna de las principales elementos de la literatura marxista, desde luego en Marx, a partir del desarrollo del concepto de capital ficticio, y principalmente de tres autores, uno marxista, Hilferding, y dos no marxistas, Veblen y Hobson, que estudiaron, digamos, el desarrollo de las corporaciones capitalistas a finales del siglo XIX, y a partir de ahí y de su estudio sobre todo el capital ficticio, doy algunas ideas sobre qué papel juega la formación de la ganancia financiera y en todo este proceso de financiarización para explicar, digamos, la propia crisis. Ese es, pues, básicamente el contenido del libro, y al final termina con algunas reflexiones de hasta qué punto o no la crisis global ha modificado el cuadro mundial en términos geopolíticos, si la hegemonía de Estados Unidos se encuentra o no en declinación, el asunto del ascenso de China y toda la problemática ligada a esta cuestión de la hegemonía, que obviamente no tendría el caso ni tendría tiempo para tratar de desarrollar más ampliamente. Ese es el contenido básicamente de este libro.
Gracias, Arturo. And now another book, also coordinated by Arturo Guillén, Antonina Ivanova, Alicia Girón, and Eugenia Correa, Public Policies to Face the Crisis and Reach Sustainable Development. That's the title in English.
Bien, este libro, con el título que ahí está expuesto, Políticas Públicas para Enfrentar la Crisis, es, digamos, el tercer libro de una red de investigación nacional formada a partir de la iniciativa que ha tenido el PRODEP. No sé si ustedes identifican qué es el PRODEP, pero es un programa básicamente para el desarrollo de las universidades de provincia, para el desarrollo del profesorado, y este grupo, esta red que se llama Globalización Financiera y Desarrollo Sustentable, está integrada por un lado por las colegas del Seminario de Economía Fiscal y Financiera de aquí de la UNAM, es decir, hay un sector UNAM, está integrado por un cuerpo académico de mi universidad, de la UAM Iztapalapa, en donde está el profesor Marshall, Gregorio Vidal y un servidor, y un equipo de un cuerpo académico de la Universidad de Baja California Sur. Creo yo que lo interesante del trabajo que desarrollamos a lo largo de varios años es que cada grupo tiene su propio campo de estudio, estudia diferentes problemas, como sabemos y lo estamos viendo el día de hoy. Pues el grupo de Economía Financiera, encabezado por la doctora Correa, Alicia Girón y Patricia Rodríguez, pues se ha especializado en los temas financieros. En el caso de la UAM hemos trabajado más los temas de crisis e integración económica, y en el caso de Baja California casi todos los profesores de ese cuerpo académico trabajan en problemas de sustentabilidad y de desarrollo sustentable. Entonces eso permitió, digamos, una conjunción muy interesante, y que aquí están los saldos de este libro, que se llama Políticas Públicas para Enfrentar la Crisis y alcanzar un desarrollo sustentable. El libro tiene algunos trabajos que pretenden ser teóricos sobre la crisis, en donde participamos algunos colegas de esta red y nos apoyamos también en el trabajo de algunos profesores externos, en particular en este número o en este libro colaboran Claude Serfati, que es un economista marxista francés que ha trabajado estos temas de la crisis, y invitamos también a que participara en el libro John Weeks, que también es un viejo economista marxista de los Estados Unidos y que nos permitió eso, conjuntar toda la parte relativa a la crisis, ¿no? Y posteriormente ya cada uno empieza a analizar aspectos más particulares de distintas cuestiones, y el grupo de Baja California Sur, como lo planteaba, básicamente se enfoca a problemas de la crisis ambiental y problemas ambientales ya en términos regionales, en particular en la península de Baja California, a partir sobre todo del desarrollo de la minería y del turismo, ¿no?, como actividades centrales de ese estado, y que han generado también una serie de problemas ambientales en la península que son analizados aquí en el libro.
Gracias, Arturo. Y ahora tenemos revistas con contribuciones de miembros de la red: Hola Financiera, International Journal of Political Economy, Review of Keynesian Economics, Forum for Social Economics, and Journal for Economic Issues. So I think, I don't know if Eric, okay, oops, yep. Okay. What's going on? Yeah. So I think now we are going to ask Eric Haig to talk about International Journal of Political Economy, right? Is that right? Or what? Journal of Economic Issues. I'm sorry. So please, Eric.
I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to be talking about, so I'm glad I wasn't the only one. I have been involved with the Association for Evolutionary Economics for my entire professional career. I actually was exposed to institutional economics as a graduate student. I was fortunate enough to attend the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, when the Journal of Economic Issues and the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics were both housed there, and pretty much I fell closer to the institutionalists than the Keynesians that were there. Paul Davidson was the leading Keynesian, post-Keynesian, editing that journal at the time, and my interests in this field have continued. That's been a large part of my career service to that organization. Institutionalist theory and the Journal of Economic Issues is very much continuing the work established by the founder of institutional theory, Thorstein Veblen. I had the opportunity to write my dissertation on Thorstein Veblen and his theories of finance, and have tried to encourage more people to understand the work of Thorstein Veblen. During his career, Thorstein Veblen was writing during a time that saw an enormous growth of the power of the firm, and he outlined very clearly the role of the corporation and the emergence of the corporation in the late 19th century. He was one of the few economists at the time that focused on that issue. He is perhaps best known for his theory of the leisure class, which is widely considered a classic in sociology as well as in economics. But few people realize, well, that he was writing about the period of time in which there was not a strong state, the rise of free market theory, and the rise of an economics profession that was referred to as the apologists, that supported the growth and consolidation of power. And I would argue that in this current environment, when we have seen and are currently seeing a decline in the other social systems that can counter that economic power in a period of time that we have globalization and the growth of transnational corporations that are essentially remaking our societies. Thorstein Veblen's work is very, very relevant because he wrote about that when it first appeared prior to the establishment of a more interventionist state or the rise of labor unions and labor political action that could counter those forces. Now that we have seen a relative decline of the power of unions and the power of organized political action around the globe, now that we have seen a decline and a decay and a hollowing out of the political systems designed for the improvement of public welfare or social welfare, and the loss of politicians who believe that there is a purpose and a good purpose for social policy, I think we're living in a time that Thorstein Veblen actually did describe very well about 100 years ago. It's very, very remarkably similar. I did not publish a book on this subject, but I did participate in a book called Thorstein Veblen and the Revival of Free Market Capitalism, given the rise of this policy, these policies since the 1970s and the 1980s, the end of the Keynesian era, and a reversion back to many of these, what I would argue, are more primitive beliefs. I'd like to just point out that you can read a lot about these issues and other people writing in the current institutionalist tradition within the Journal of Economics, Journal of Economic Issues. In terms of Thorstein Veblen, one of the reasons I would argue he is still a rich source of information is that many writers that have been critical of free market economics and the mainstream economic theory or neoclassical economic theory have pointed out that Veblen actually described things very, very well. Joan Robinson in the Capital Controversies said, in opening up, she said, Veblen described this better than I can, and then she gave her argument about what was capital. We have seen Keynes as well made some positive remarks. So Veblen, there is a great source of information. While people identify Veblen with the theory of the leisure class primarily, I would point out that he was an economist that created a unified theory that was very, very different than the theory that it replaced, or he tried to replace, or the theory that came after. And if we are looking for other unified theories that can explain how a system of unregulated capitalism actually works, Veblen did actually describe that. He had a unified theory in which he described a theory of the consumer, as I've already pointed out. He has a theory of production that he developed. He has a theory of the firm based on the corporation rather than a perfectly competitive system. He has a theory of the business cycle, monetary system, and a system of income distribution. And he built that entire system prior to the rise of Keynesian economics. And he built it in an attempt to dismantle the arguments made by the apologists defending free market capitalism and the rise of a Gilded Age. So I think we are living in another Gilded Age, definitely. And so I think reading a little Veblen, reading a little institutional economics, and looking at the Journal of Economic Issues is not a bad thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Very nice explanation. So I think now we come to the comments by Juan Carlos Moreno Vid, who is, I presume, the only person that have digested all these books and journals. So he will give us, a wonderful landscape presentation, discussion of those books. So.
Muchas gracias, Nacho, muchas gracias, Eugenia, Alicia, a los que están aquí, a los colegas de fuera. Voy a hablar en español para los colegas más jóvenes, que no estoy tan seguro si mi inglés sería suficientemente bueno. Y pues solo en inglés, what you've done is great, what you're doing is great, what you're doing is also great. But in synthesis, that's what I'm going to say about you. Okay? Cuando me invitó Alicia y Eugenia a hacer este comentario de libros, es un poco extraño, ¿no? Porque dije, qué cosa tan rara. Pero dije, no, obviamente Nacho tiene razón, leí cada uno de los libros de cabo a rabo, inclusive los comentaristas, los críticos constructivos y negativos de cada libro, lo tengo en la mano, pero decidí que ese no era el propósito. Me sentí como más bien, como hay es un gusto para empezar a haber sido invitado a hacer esto. Es como dos cosas. Tengo una hija que le gusta mucho ver ER, Emergency Room. Es un salón lleno de doctores que resuelven problemas y crean cosas interesantes y cada vez quiere seguir viendo. Aquí es un ER, pero de mujeres. Son llenos de doctoras que resuelven problemas interesantes y siempre quiere seguir viendo el siguiente capítulo. Eso es lo que nos enseñaron ahorita, es una serie de capítulos muy, muy interesantes, pero lo que creo que es muy importante es la obra, porque esta es una obra de mujeres en el gran sentido de la palabra que tienen, que es, bueno, está Noemí, está Alejandra, suma y sigue Patricia, en fin, tiene una característica de inclusión, no solo es relevante lo que están tocando. Voy a tomar el tema de financiación, no sé si ellas inventaron la crisis financiera internacional para que el seminario se volviera más relevante, o si al revés el seminario y ellas empezaron a analizar todo esto. Son tremendamente incluyentes, la cantidad de redes con las que han creado lazos de gente alguna que a lo mejor no se habla una entre la otra, y ustedes las logran traer a la mesa, las logran que escriba capítulos, la cantidad de países que están tocando, la cantidad de regiones, sinceramente es impresionante. Es un poco también, y la otra analogía que me queda es como la paella. O sea, ustedes lo que presentaron es el camarón, el pollo, el chorizo, no sé cuál es cuál, pero el arroz, todo. Pero lo que importa es el contenido. La manera de mezclarlo es lo que hace una gran paella. Y otra cosa que puede ser un pegote, un engrudo. Lo ustedes es una gran paella, esa suma es maravillosa. Y a la vez lo que tiene es que raya casi en complot, porque la cantidad de temas no son aleatorios, están tocando las razones con los colegas de otras universidades también. ¿Qué es lo que no funciona en nuestro sistema? Pero no es así nada más de cualquier perspectiva. Tienen una vocación docente, porque hay mucho de docencia, muchos de los capítulos que han trabajado en todos estos libros y a lo largo del seminario han sido con estudiantes muy jóvenes, que algunos ya se volvieron en colegas, que son doctores también, pero abrirle la puerta a la gente más joven con el nombre de ustedes es muy agradable para los jóvenes poderse acercar y tener la garantía de que van a publicar, van a ser reconocidos, se les va a abrir un mundo relevante en términos también de una perspectiva teórica. O sea, no es cualquier perspectiva teórica, es la perspectiva post-keynesiana. Tiene también en ese sentido una pauta metodológica. Entonces, todo está acomodado desde esta visión. Y también, como hemos visto aquí, hay también una vocación histórica, sumada a una muy, muy importante, que quizá es lo que guía este complot de la paella y del ER, que es la política pública. El caso de Alejandra en particular, de Arturo, de muchos de los que han presentado libros o los artículos. En realidad es querer entender el mundo para cambiar el mundo, querer educar a los alumnos para que se apasionen por la economía, por lo que entraron alguna vez. No le tienen miedo a las matemáticas, hay muchas matemáticas en lo que hacen muchos de los colegas que están con ustedes. Entonces, sinceramente, lo que a mí me da mucho gusto es que, además, pues también me han invitado, soy parte del seminario, así que podría decir que soy juez y parte en cierto sentido. Me da mucho gusto pertenecer a esta ya una empresa en el buen sentido schumpeteriano de la palabra. Creo que es creación, no sé, creo que no sé si destrucción creativa, yo creo que aquí es construcción muy creativa. Las felicito, agradezco a los alumnos, a los jóvenes. Ahí está la Meireles también, que me da mucho gusto verla. La Mónica, perdón, a Meireles, es con todo cariño. Porque también se mezclan los temas de desarrollo, los países que han mencionado ustedes, Brasil, Chile, México. Han puesto a México en el mundo, tienen el análisis que permite entender la economía mexicana no solamente autocentrada y viéndose el ombligo, sino qué está pasando en los circuitos financieros internacionales, por qué México está, cómo se inserta. Además, con una visión brutal. Yo no sé si también, insisto, capaz que ustedes trajeron a Trump para que Rodolfo publicara su trabajo sobre el retorno de los migrantes, porque qué visión poder tener ese libro ahorita, y lo del TLC también. Hay un talento del buen cocinero de hacer una buena paella, decir, mira, creo que es el momento del azafrán, vamos a meterle el azafrán ahora. Los felicito, a Nacho también lo felicito, obviamente, director de los posgrados, tener un seminario de esta creatividad. Y thank you, muchas gracias, you're great, you're doing great things. Y bueno, pues esto es todo lo que me queda decir. Y un día, si quieren, sí les cuento todo, cada uno de los capítulos del libro, lo que tienen ahí en los pies de páginas, que hay algunos que, bueno, sinceramente, el pie de 14 del tomo 3, siento que se podía haber cambiado un poco, pero no es el momento. Felicidades y gracias por haberme invitado.